Hi, and welcome to my presentation on subsystems and myofascial lines for my personal fitness trainer course 1220. Today we're going to look at how myofascial lines actually impact movement within the body. So when we talk about muscles and functional movement of the body, it's important for us to consider the fascia of the body. Fascia is basically a collagenous sheet of tissue that essentially holds the muscles of the body together and assists our muscles to function and create movement. So the myofascial line theory suggests that muscles are frequently connected through their fascia and that the fibers of muscles often blend from one muscle into the next. When this merging of muscle fiber and fascia occurs, these muscle groups and their respective connective tissue then create a bit of an anatomical continuity where a chain of muscles become interconnected across lines of the body. So Thomas Myers, the author of our textbook Anatomy Chains, explains that myofascial lines are essentially groups of muscles that are anatomically connected via their fascia, and hence any movement or conversely any imbalance within one muscle of a myofascial line will affect the other muscles and fascia of the same corresponding line. There are 6 main myofascial lines that run through the body: the superficial front line, the superficial back line, lateral lines, spiral line, arm lines, and the deep front line. Today, we'll look at the first 4 of these. So we're going to start with the superficial back line. The superficial back line connects and protects the entire posterior surface of the body from the bottoms of the feet to the top of the head in 2 pieces, from the toes to the knees, and then from the knees to the brow, which is on the other side, the front side of the head. When we are standing and the knees are extended as they are in this diagram, the superficial back line functions as one continuous line. It runs from the bottom of the toes, around the heels, up through the back of the body, and is made up of the plantar fascia at the foot, the Achilles tendon, the gastrocnemius muscle, up into the hamstrings, towards the sarcotuberous ligament, and then up through the erector spinae to the suboccipitals, and then over the crown of the head to the brow, kind of into the forehead area in the front of the body. From a movement perspective, the job of the superficial back line is to flex the knees and to flex the ankle, and to create extension and hyperextension through the hip and the spine. The overall postural function of the superficial back line is to support the body in a full upright position and to prevent curling over into flexion. A higher proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers are present in the superficial back line due to the endurance requirement of maintaining an upright posture. The superficial back line. The movement function of the superficial back line is to flex at the knee and at the ankle, and also to create extension and hyperextension through the spine and hips. Posturally, it acts to keep our body from curling over into flexion and also keeps us in an upright position. An example of a way to stretch the superficial back line would be to do a forward fold. Next is the superficial front line. The superficial front line connects the anterior surface of the body from the tops of the feet to the sides of the skull in 2 pieces, from the toes to the pelvis, and then from the pelvis to the head. When the hips are extended, as they are in this picture, the superficial front line acts in one continuous line. So the superficial front line lies on the anterior part of the body and runs from the top of the foot to the skull on both sides, incorporating the short and long toe extensors, the anterior tibialis, the patellar tendon, the quadricep muscles, the rectus abdominis, up through the sternocondral fascia to the sternocleidomastoid. The overall movement function of the superficial front line is to create flexion of the trunk and hips, extension at the knee, and dorsiflexion of the foot. Posturally, the function of the superficial front line is to counterbalance the superficial back line and to provide support from the top to lift the parts of the skeleton which extend forward of the gravity line. And this would include the rib cage, the pubis, and the face. The superficial front line also maintains knee extension. Because the superficial front line at times must produce powerful flexion movements, the musculature here contains a greater proportion of fast twitch muscle fibers. The superficial front line, the postural function of the superficial front line is to balance the superficial back line to keep us from extending backward. The movement function creates flexion through the front of the body, and it also creates extension at the knee, dorsiflexion at the foot. An example of stretching the front line of the body would be upward facing dog from yoga. So there are some characteristics that are unique to the superficial back line and the superficial front line. I'm going to take a moment here just to draw these in. So the superficial front line runs down this section of the body and also extends back to here, where the superficial back line begins here and runs down this section of the body. So while we typically speak of the superficial back line and superficial front line in the singular form, it's important to remember that there are actually two of each. So we have a superficial back line that runs down the left side of the body as well as the right side, and the same holds true for the superficial front line. What we've been talking about today in terms of these myofascial lines have been on the superficial level. It is important to note that there is a deep front line, while at the same time there is not a deep back line. As mentioned before, the superficial back line contains mostly slow twitch muscle fibers. That's due to the fact that these muscle fibers contribute in a manner that's very endurance-based to holding our upright posture. The superficial front line contains mainly fast twitch muscle fibers, and that's due to the necessity at times for them to contract forcefully. The lateral line brackets each side of the body beginning from the medial underside of the foot, around the outside ankle, up the lateral sides of the legs, through the peroneals, up through the outside of the thigh and the iliotibial tract, up towards the outside of the hip, towards the waist. Now at the rib cage, the lateral line actually starts a series of kind of crisscrossing patterns, almost like shoelaces that are sewing the front and the back of the body together via the sides. From there, it comes underneath the shoulder and up towards the skull and ends up kind of around the ear area. The lateral line's movement functions include lateral flexion of the trunk, abduction at the hip, and eversion of the foot. It also acts to stop lateral or rotational movements of the trunk. Posturally, the lateral line balances front and back, and also left and right. The lateral line also mediates the forces of other superficial lines and serves to restrict energy inefficient actions. Almost any kind of lateral flexion of the trunk and abduction of the leg will engage the lateral line, stretching it on one side and contracting it on the other. The lateral line. From a movement perspective, the lateral line causes us to be able to do lateral flexion in the body. It also creates abduction in the leg and eversion in the foot. Posturally, it balances us left and right and front and back, and it also reduces hyperrotation and hyperlateral flexion. An example of a stretch and a movement would be the half moon stretch, where one side of the body is activated and the other side is being stretched. The spiral line. The spiral line creates a loop around the body, joining each side of the skull across the upper back to the opposite shoulder, and then comes underneath the armpit to crisscross the rib cage at about the height of the navel, and then comes down towards the hip, the knee, and then crosses in front of the shin to loop underneath the foot so that it can start its journey back up the back of the body, where it continues up towards the ischium, up through the erector spinae, which you can't see here, towards the back of the skull. So essentially what's being created is an unending loop that moves through the body and connects it. The spiral line interacts with many of the other myofascial lines and is involved in almost every movement performed by the body. Its main movement function is to generate and control all rotational movements in the body. The spiral line functions posturally to maintain the integrity and stability of the spine and to maintain balance across all planes. Dysfunction in the spiral line can affect the functioning of other myofascial lines. The spiral line. The movement function of the spiral line is to create and to control rotation through the body. Posturally, it provides structural and strength base to the spine and also provides us balance in all planes of movement. An example of a movement that would require the spiral line would be a seated twist from yoga. So as one section of the spiral line is activated, the spiral line on the other side of the body is being stretched. So in conclusion, the classification of a group of muscles as a myofascial line is based on longitudinal connections between muscles, fascia, and their connective tissues. And this creates a relatively continuous structure across and along the body. An understanding of how the various parts of the body are connected and how these connections relate to functional movement patterns can allow for a far more effective program design for the personal trainer.